Its navy had shattered fleets, conquered territories, and humiliated the United States at the attack on Pearl Harbor. In June 1942, Japan ruled the Pacific. To many, the Japanese Empire looked unstoppable. But then, in just a few catastrophic hours, 4 aircraft carriers burned, and the empire that terrified the Pacific began a collapse it would never recover from. This was the Battle of Midway, the battle that crippled Japan forever. When Japan attacked Pearl Harbor in December 1941, the balance of power in the Pacific changed overnight. American battleships burned in the harbor, shock spread across the world, and Japan moved fast. Hong Kong, the Philippines, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies. Victory after victory. At the center of this expansion stood the Imperial Japanese Navy, arguably the most experienced carrier force on Earth. Its pilots were elite, its coordination was deadly, its confidence was enormous. But confidence can become dangerous, because after months of victories, Japan's military leadership began believing something fatal: that the Americans were already beaten. But wars are not decided only by armies or fleets. They are shaped by decisions made under pressure, by moments of overconfidence, by mistakes no one realizes are fatal until it is too late. History is not just a record of the past, it is a blueprint of power. Every empire that rose, every nation that fell, was shaped by decisions made under pressure. And sometimes, a single moment changes the direction of an entire civilization. For Japan, the Battle of Midway was one of those moments. By the spring of 1942, the Imperial Japanese Navy appeared invincible. No force in the Pacific had managed to stop its advance. In only a few months, Japan had shattered fleets, captured entire territories, and pushed the United States back across the ocean. To much of the world, the rising sun now seemed unstoppable. Its aircraft carriers ruled the Pacific like floating fortresses. But Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto understood something many others refused to admit. America was wounded, not defeated. The American carrier fleet had survived Pearl Harbor. Somewhere beyond the horizon, it was still alive. Yamamoto feared that if the United States had time to recover its industrial power, the war would eventually turn against Japan. So he proposed a dangerous plan. He would lure the remaining American carriers into one decisive battle and destroy them completely. The target would be Midway Atoll, a tiny island far out in the Pacific that guarded the approach to Hawaii itself. If Midway fell, Japan could threaten Pearl Harbor again. If the Americans defended it, Yamamoto believed he could trap and annihilate their fleet. In late May 1942, a massive Japanese armada began moving east across the Pacific. Battleships, cruisers, destroyers, submarines, and carriers advanced through the ocean mist. At the center of the operation sailed 4 legendary aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, veterans of Pearl Harbor. Their pilots were among the most experienced naval aviators on Earth. Their crews had spent months winning battle after battle. To many Japanese sailors, this operation felt less like a gamble and more like the final step toward victory. Midway itself was little more than coral, sand, and a handful of airstrips isolated in the middle of the Pacific. But for the United States, the island was a shield, protecting Hawaii and the American West Coast. If Midway was lost, Japan's Navy would gain a direct path deeper into the Pacific. Washington could not afford to let that happen. But while the Japanese fleets moved across the ocean, another battle had already begun far from the carriers and warships. Inside a windowless basement in Hawaii, American cryptanalysts worked day and night, surrounded by intercepted radio messages and code fragments. Slowly, they began breaking parts of Japan's naval code system known as JN-25. Again and again, one mysterious objective appeared inside Japanese transmissions: AF. American intelligence suspected AF was Midway, but they needed proof before risking their remaining carriers. So the Americans sent a fake radio message from Midway, claiming the island's water purification system had broken down. Soon after, Japanese intercepts reported that AF was experiencing a water shortage. The trap was exposed. Admiral Chester Nimitz now knew exactly where Japan intended to strike. Nimitz faced an enormous risk. America had only a few operational carriers left in the Pacific. If he lost them here, Hawaii itself could become vulnerable to attack. But instead of retreating, Nimitz made a bold gamble. He ordered his carriers to ambush the Japanese fleet northeast of Midway. The location was nicknamed Point Luck, and for the American Navy, luck was exactly what they needed. Hidden beneath rain squalls and thick morning clouds, the American carriers waited silently across the Pacific. Pilots sat beside armed aircraft while crews scanned the empty horizon for signs of the enemy. Hours passed. Radios remained silent. The ocean around them seemed endless and empty. Neither side fully understood how close the opposing fleets already were. At dawn on June 4, 1942, Japanese aircraft engines roared to life across the carrier decks. Wave after wave of bombers and Zero fighters launched into the sky, heading toward Midway to destroy the island once and for all. Soon, explosions ripped across the atoll. Fires spread through the airfields as smoke climbed high above the Pacific. To many Japanese pilots, the battle already appeared won, but then an urgent report suddenly reached the Japanese flagship Akagi. An American carrier had been spotted nearby. Panic and indecision gripped the Japanese flagship, the Akagi. The entire operation now faced a terrifying problem. Japanese aircraft returning from Midway were still landing and refueling. At the same time, new weapons would be needed for an attack against American warships instead of land targets. Admiral Kiichi Nagumo hesitated. His crews began rearming the planes with torpedoes and anti-ship bombs. Fuel hoses stretched across the hangar decks. Bombs, ammunition, and aircraft crowded the carriers below deck. In only a few minutes, the most powerful fleet in the Pacific had unknowingly become dangerously vulnerable. Then, another delay came. Conflicting scout reports created confusion about the exact location of the American carriers. Nagumo continued, preparing his counterstrike, unaware that disaster was already descending from above. Suddenly, frantic lookouts pointed toward the sky. High above the clouds, American dive bombers had arrived. The bombers plunged almost vertically toward the Japanese carriers below in a screaming descent from the heavens. Japanese anti-aircraft fire erupted across the fleet as crews desperately tried to respond. But the carriers below were crowded with fueled aircraft, armed bombs, and exposed ammunition. Then the first bomb struck. Flames erupted across the Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu almost simultaneously. Explosions tore through the hangar decks as fuel and munitions ignited into massive firestorms. Within minutes, 3 of Japan's greatest carriers were mortally wounded. The pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy was burning in the middle of the Pacific. Only Hiryu remained operational. Desperate Japanese pilots launched counterattacks against the American fleet. For a brief moment, the battle continued. Bombs slammed into the American carrier Yorktown, leaving it burning and crippled. But by the end of the day, Hiryu too was hunted down and destroyed. In just a few catastrophic hours, Japan had lost 4 elite aircraft carriers and many of its most experienced naval aviators. The losses could not easily be replaced. Japan still had ships, but the core of its carrier strength had been shattered forever. Yamamoto's carefully designed trap had turned against him. The strategic balance of the Pacific was shifting. Midway was more than a battle. It was the moment Japan lost the initiative in the Pacific War. From that point forward, the empire that once advanced across Asia and the Pacific would spend the rest of the war fighting defensively. The hunters had become the hunted, and the long road to Tokyo had begun. Ships could be rebuilt, steel could be forged again, new carriers could eventually return to the sea, but experienced naval aviators were far harder to replace. Japan's carrier force depended on years of brutal training, battlefield coordination, and combat experience earned across the Pacific. Its pilots were not simply soldiers. They were the core of Japan's naval warfare system. And at Midway, Japan lost many of the men who had carried its victories from Pearl Harbor to the Indian Ocean. The battle destroyed far more than aircraft carriers and burning steel. It destroyed institutional skill, veteran pilots, carrier coordination, operational confidence. The Imperial Japanese Navy would continue fighting for years across the Pacific. But after Midway, it was never truly the same force again. The strategic initiative had shifted away from Japan for the first time since Pearl Harbor. From this point forward, Japan increasingly fought defensively, reacting instead of advancing. Meanwhile, the United States unleashed the full power of its industry, building ships, aircraft, and weapons on a scale Japan could never match. Slowly, the balance of the Pacific began turning west toward Tokyo. Historians still debate whether Midway alone won the Pacific War, but one reality is difficult to ignore. Before Midway, Japan expanded. After Midway, Japan struggled to recover. The battle exposed how fragile even the most victorious empire could become under pressure. One intelligence breakthrough, one vulnerable moment, one devastating strike, and suddenly the balance of the Pacific changed forever. The empire that once looked unstoppable had lost control of the momentum. And from that moment onward, the war slowly began moving back toward Japan itself. The Battle of Midway was not just a naval defeat, it was the moment Japan lost the momentum of empire. The moment for burning aircraft carriers changed the future of World War II. Because sometimes, history does not turn over decades. Sometimes, it changes in a few terrifying minutes. And the men fighting that day often had no idea they were witnessing the collapse of an era. If you want more stories about forgotten battles, military disasters, and the moments that changed history forever, subscribe to Think Smart Media and tell me in the comments, was Midway truly the turning point of the Pacific War? Or was Japan already doomed the moment it attacked Pearl Harbor?